welcome. Currently I'm studying Genesis, and the other day I was reading chapters 21 and 22. And as I was reading these chapters, a few verses stood out for me, so I stopped and decided to delve into them a little bit deeper. And the insight that I gained from these verses made me realise that these verses were very, very significant in how chapter 22 plays out. Now, in chapter 22, we learn about Abraham and his greatest test of faith. And this was when God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable, and that was to let go of his son, his precious promised son, Isaac. Now, have you ever been in a situation where you've waited decades for a promise from God and you finally get it and you're enjoying it, and then all of a sudden you lose it? Something happens and you have to say goodbye to it, you have to let it go. So why does that happen? Now, God is a good God, so whatever happens in our life, there's always a reason for it, and that reason is always good. Now, God knows our tendency to cling on to gifts that He has given us with such tenacity that we end up digging our fingernails into them, and they become our precious. And when they become our precious, they end up becoming so precious that they're more precious than the giver, that we end up valuing our gift from Him more than Him Himself. The problem when we don't relinquish things to God is that they're always in our hands, and the enemy roams around and he is after the things that we have in our hands. Now, God showed me a few years ago the principle of nothing left to lose, because when you have things in your hands, the enemy is always at you and he can always take them from you if you're not careful. But when you relinquish everything to God, guess what? You've got nothing left to lose, and that becomes your greatest weapon against the enemy. So let's return to Abraham, because Abraham was facing the same sort of test. God had promised him a son. He finally has a son, but not only a son, but an incredible promise of being the father of all nations. And now we hear in chapter 22 that God is asking him to let it all go. How did Abraham manage to do that? How did Abraham manage to keep walking in faith? And I believe that the key to how he coped with all of that are found in these verses that I had read. Now, these verses, there's two verses in the last chapter of 21 and the first verse of chapter 22. They're very, very significant. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he worshipped Yahweh, the everlasting God. And Abraham lived many years in peace as a foreigner in the Philistine country. Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said, "Abraham." "Yes, I'm here," Abraham answered. So, there were a number of elements in these verses that really pointed to how Abraham managed to carry out his step of faith. He was in a season just prior to this testing where he planted a tamarisk tree. He sat under that tree and worshipped the everlasting God. He lived in peace in a country that wasn't his own, a country that was going to be his promised land, but he wasn't quite there yet. And then he got to a place of surrender where he said, "Lord, here I am." Now, the planting of the tamarisk tree was very significant. For Abraham, he was planting this tree as a statement of faith. And this particular type of tree lasts a very long time. It's a tree that grows for many generations. It grows very tall. It's a stately tree. So this particular tree was a statement. It was almost like an altar to God. This was something that Abraham wanted to plant as a statement of his faith. And he sat under that tree and worshipped the everlasting God. Now, the interesting thing is that the Hebrew for everlasting God in this passage is El Olam. Now, El Olam is not a name of God that we're very familiar with. I'd actually never heard of this particular name until I studied it. And then I started to realize that worshipping El Olam is the key to handling steps of faith where God is testing our faith. Because El Olam is God eternal. And worshipping El Olam, we develop an eternal perspective on life. When we dwell on El Olam, we start to understand God's viewpoint. We start to see everything from an eternal perspective. And then after a period of time that Abraham was worshipping El Olam, he started to gain peace. Now, Abraham was living in a land which was eventually going to be Israel, but at that particular time, it was occupied by the Philistines. So he was a man of promise and he was almost there, but the timing just wasn't right just yet. And he had to learn to live in peace in a foreign land. And I believe worshipping El Olam helped him gain that peace. And then after many years of living in peace and worshipping under his tree, the El Olam, he got to a place of surrender where when God spoke to him, he said, "Here I am." Now, are you finding right at this moment you're feeling a little bit like Abraham when he was going through his test of faith? That incredibly difficult test of faith where you're having to face the possibility of letting go of something that you had only just gained from God. Maybe you had this job that you'd been praying for so long, and because of the pandemic and the chaos that this has caused, you've now lost that job. You may have set up a ministry or started a business, and now you're having to face the possibility of letting it all go. Can I suggest to going back to these 3 verses and looking at what Abraham did? Our tamarisk tree is our statement of faith. But don't just make a statement of faith. Don't just plant a tamarisk tree and walk away. Do what Abraham did and sit under that statement of faith and get to know El Olam. And when we get to know El Olam, we develop an eternal perspective which then highlights the goodness of God and helps us to see things in a long-term picture. And it helps us to put everything into perspective. And this gives us peace because we know that El Olam is in control. When we've taken time to look at things from an eternal perspective, all of a sudden we realize that God has got this. He is in control. We actually don't have to be in control, which is so releasing. It gives us that freedom of knowing that because God is El Olam, that even though we don't understand what is happening right now, He does, because He's got the bigger picture. And then when we have this peace and we continue on in that peace, we get to that point of surrender where we say, "Here I am, Lord, you can have my precious. I give it to you because I know you are the Rock of Ages. You are the everlasting King. I give you control of my life. I give you control of my gift because you are El Olam." Thank you for watching. If this message has encouraged you or even challenged you, you are welcome to leave a comment, and please remember to subscribe.